Do you own or lease? Driving about on the country lanes of central Illinois, we see a lot of activity beginning to happen in the barns and silos. The combine is being serviced, the grain dryers are being checked, the trucks are being cleaned. All is getting ready for a couple of weeks of gathering the fruits of corn and soybeans from the land, and to either put them in storage or put them to market. Many of the fields are owned by someone, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're being harvested by the same person. The work might be completed by someone who does not own the land on which the crops are planted, but rather rents it and then shares those proceeds in what's usually called a cash rent arrangement between the owner of the land and the one who takes responsibility for gathering the harvest after planting, or simply as a tenant. Now, there must be mutual respect and shared responsibility between owner and tenant, an agreement that is beneficial to both. The tenant will perform the best form of land management and crop management. The owner will keep the real estate taxes paid. Each person has their role and their responsibility, and both will be held accountable for keeping that. To live a generous life, you must share the fruits of its labors. It must also be ready to account for it. Generosity can only be encouraged when one is found trustworthy with the gifts of others that fulfill a larger mission, a larger ministry, a larger cause than our own self-interests. An organization of any size, shape, or form must prove that it finds itself fiscally responsible to receive any additional support and commitment in order for it to fulfill its ministry and its missions. Now, we've been taught to be very wary of both leaders or organizations that choose to withhold information or to show dishonesty in their practices and policies. If either of them are disrespectful or irresponsible, it's likely that they are also dishonest and untrustworthy. So as we begin a new series this month of a journey into a life of generosity, we encounter this parable today of the dishonest and untrustworthy tenants and a vineyard owner. This story is called a parable, but it really doesn't have that much evidence to really be called a parable. Parables usually teach a lesson about how God operates and encounters the world in a way that's drawn from the ordinary life, but has that unexpected twist or turn in the outcome of the story. Think of the parable of the Good Samaritan. We hope someone will help him, but neither the priest nor the Levite, all the ones that we expect to give aid, don't. And the most despicable person imaginable is the one who renders the aid. Parables often begin with the kingdom of God is like, or the kingdom of heaven is like, contrasting how the world seems to operate versus how God can be seen operating. And while often they're given an allegorical treatment, a parable is rarely simply a full allegory. They're allegory plus in their nature. You probably didn't realize that there are only 3 of Jesus' parables that can be found in the Gospel of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. One of those parables that appears in all 3 Gospels is the parable of the generous sower who spreads seeds on all kinds of ground. The second one is the parable of the mustard seed, which is a really small seed that grows remarkably large. And then it's this parable, the parable of the wicked tenants. And like I said, this parable is more allegorical than a typical parable. It goes into a lot of detail, especially in Matthew's version, of a landowner who provides everything that is necessary to harvest the produce from a vineyard. Every possible machine and device necessary is present for this vineyard. And this equipment is made then available to tenants, renters, to be able for them to do the work, to gather and to process the harvest, and then following the harvest to share its proceeds between the owner and the workers. The owner, we are told, leaves for a time while giving the responsibility of caretaking and harvesting to the tenants. Now, Jesus is not pulling any surprises here in describing a vineyard. Vineyard is an often used image in Scripture, used to identify the land and people of Israel. So we know from the get-go that the owner of the land is God, and that the vineyard is Israel. But who are these tenants? They are those that are responsible for caring for the vineyard and for the fruit that it produces. And certainly as Jesus is speaking this, he's arrived in Jerusalem, he's done the cleansing of the temple. It's no surprise who these tenants are. They are the religious leaders. But the relationship between the owner and the tenants appears to sour, shall we say, as soon as the owner sends the first of several groups of slaves to collect what is rightfully his share. There is nothing in the story that shows that this owner is dishonest in expecting to receive his portion. There's nothing in the story to tell us that he's unfair. And neither are his slaves that are even attempting to extort more than what is expected. It is the tenants themselves who suddenly now refuse to provide the share and then proceed to beat, kill, and stone each of the owner's representatives sent to collect the harvest. Their rejection becomes disobedience, disrespect, and irresponsibility. The tenants withhold the harvest to seize a ludicrous impossibility. Ownership. The depth of their twisted reasoning is revealed when, rather than receiving the owner's son with respect, they are making plans to kill him out of greed. These tenants are merely employees. They're not even independent contractors. And these tenants seem to have forgotten the original terms and conditions. Short of purchasing this property directly from the owner, which they don't seem to be interested in, this is a lease agreement. You get to use another person's property for your personal use for a prescribed amount of time. It's not unlike the copy machine here at Prairie Avenue Christian Church. A company in Mattoon owns it, but they give us, for an exchange of money, the ability to copy. The owner has provided everything that would assure the tenants of their harvest success. But even asking for a mere portion of that success seems to be too much for the tenants to do. They would rather kill the owner's son than to share any amount of the harvest. Truth be told, our lives were established in a form of trust relationship, a lease of time, talent, and treasure, and certainly our lives are a gift rather than a right. It's when we treat our lives as if we own them rather than tenants and guests that we begin to withhold and withdraw what was never ours to begin with in order to make irresponsible claims of exemption and excuses to the one who truly holds ownership. God possesses our lives. Our reception of that life is and always will be an unmerited gift. A thriving life of generosity recognizes this and recognizes our role is to work for one who has been providing everything, entrusting us to care responsibly for what has been provided and to share joyfully in the fruits of the harvest. Now is that season of collecting fruit, and Jesus is interested in whether we are ready and willing to produce the fruits of the kingdom through our lives. His demand for fruitful living is a demand for changed lives. And this story gives us a fair and very clear warning. Those who have been given the responsibility to gather the harvest, but do not gather and do not share, will find themselves in peril. Those who reject others may find themselves also rejected. This property will be given to those who will not withhold the proceeds away from the rightful owner. Looking back at the history of this place and through the seasons of plenty and seasons of want that this vineyard of 96 years has had, I think we can fairly say that it was God working through human beings that set the equipment up and gave some 60 individuals the first responsibilities of sharing the fruit of the vine, the good news of Jesus Christ here in this place, at this location. Some of those years when we were called at first 7th Street Christian Church were some of the leanest economic years we faced as a nation in the depths of the greatest economic crisis ever, the Great Depression in the 1930s. Others at those times came to our aid when we were faltering. And there was an early crisis of leadership that required ultimate accountability. And yet the work of the harvest for God's kingdom continued, and that harvest soon grew. The visible signs of the fruits of this harvest can be seen around you today, in brick and in stone, in floor and in ceiling, in equipment and supplies. But yet the deeper work, the harvest the vintner farmer expects, is still yet the same: the gathering of changed lives used in service, responding to the call of living lives with justice, grace, and dignity. The Pharisees and the chief priests clearly recognized who they were in this parable. They were the wicked tenants. And they were angry and wanted to arrest and seize Jesus. They would rather beat, kill, or stone God's agents than to allow the harvest to be shared with the one who provided the field to work in the first place. And you should expect me, as pastor, and your lay leadership here at Prairie Avenue, to be accountable and responsible with all of the time, talent, and treasures of this vineyard. Your labors and your sacrifice, your gifts and your talents should be seen and used as fulfilling God's ministry and mission in this place and time. We have made many good improvements towards communicating not only our gratitude, but also providing the necessary information to make informed decisions in generosity and to give you opportunities to share your time and talents and treasures in this vineyard now called Prairie Avenue Christian Church. Both staff as well as lay leadership know that your trust is earned, not given. And we intend to continually keep and maintain and earn that trust. A thriving generosity can only be present if an honest and transparent relationship of trust and commitment is established between the leadership of the organization and the organization's supporters. It is truly my fervent desire and prayer that our efforts here have not failed in establishing such a mutual relationship. Now, I know, oftentimes stewardship is boiled into the groaning and the guilt-ridden, shall I call it the Sermon on the Mount, that a pastor painfully presents every year. A surviving plan whose only goal is to keep staff and to barely maintain facilities. Generosity calls us beyond any form of bare minimum. It does not ask what the minimum amount is to get rid of guilt. It asks what we owe to one when everything we have is on loan in the first place. What should be the going rent that we pay to a Creator who has endowed each of us with talent, ambition, and faith? The tenants thought they owed the landowner nothing. The harvest says otherwise. The owner's son is arriving. The owner is expecting a reception of respect. What will God receive? Rejection or reception? A fair share, a minimum share. Respect and responsibility. What will the account statement reveal? Do you own or lease? Amen.